Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So on the screen you should see our presentation here. So today we're going to be talking about service automation tips and tricks with the Cireson portal. It's actually going to be a bit more technical than that. We're going to talk about some outward automation, so how you can use the Cireson portal to better automate certain activities. So we'll go through that and what we're going to really be focusing on here in just a second. My name is Seth Cousins. I'm the General Manager for Services here at Cireson. You can see my contact information here on the screen. So feel free to reach out to me if you guys have any questions or anything about today's webinar. All right, so let's go through a few of the normal webinar functions. So today's agenda, we will be talking about some general announcements that we do for all of our webinars. Then we'll be discussing webhooks and web integration. I'll be using Slack as an example of a tool that you can use a webhook with. Then we'll talk about some Azure functions and how those work and why you'd want to use them. And then we'll look at the Cireson portal and bring all those three things together and show how to make remote calls from the portal to trigger or send information to something like Slack or Azure, or really you can use this in any sort of fashion. But today we'll be triggering an Azure function to post information into Slack. Then we'll move a little deeper into the automation framework and we'll talk about Azure Automation and hybrid workers. This is a function of OMS, or Operations Manager Suite. We'll then look at how you can make remote HTTP calls via PowerShell and why you'd want to do that. And then we'll look at scheduling Azure runbooks, and we'll bring everything together and look at how you can use the portal to unlock an AD user by integrating with Azure Automation and hybrid workers in your environment. After that, we'll do question and answer. And that's it. So let's move into the announcements. So here's some information about Cireson in general. We were awarded to the top 5,000, so we actually did really well. We got into the 167th place, so we're actually in the top 500, which is awesome. We're number 10 for software companies and number 6 for San Diego companies. And then in the San Diego Business Journal, we're the 13th fastest growing company this last year. And in the CIO Review, 20 most promising enterprise asset management. And we just secured our SAM Gold competency, made it official, if you will. We also released the self-service portal community edition. So it's free and you just need to log into the community to download it. You can get it from our software section. It's got all of the basic self-service portions of our portal built in, and obviously it does not focus on the analyst aspects of working tickets and asset management, all those things. All those are still separate. The self-service portion is more the end-user facing portion, and we've released it in order to match what Microsoft is offering out of the box with all these extra features that we offer already. So just a quick overview of what's available in that release. All right, so let's dive into the first section of this demonstration and training, if you will. It's almost a training. I'm really just going to kind of talk through things, introduce you to things, and kind of get the creative juices flowing on how you could use these sorts of things in your business on a daily basis. So first we'll talk about webhooks. So what is a webhook? Well, a webhook is an HTTP callback, an HTTP post that occurs when something happens, or a simple event notification via HTTP post. What does that mean, really? Really, that means that you're making a call from one location to another in order to trigger something based off of an event. So in our particular case, as we work through this, we're going to use a click within the Cireson portal on a function to trigger a webhook or trigger the endpoint inside Azure, inside an Azure function, and then we're actually going to pass some data with it too in order to trigger a separate process. So event-driven automation here. So why use webhooks versus something else? Really, they're really resource light. They're very easy to use and set up, and they're event-based rather than having to go out and look for new information over and over. So instead of having to go into the database and see if something's changed, we can actually trigger that webhook and post that information out when something has changed. So event-based rather than polling. So in our example, we're going to look at posting to Slack via a webhook. And in order to do this, the first thing we have to do is create a Slack webhook integration, and then we have to test that webhook. So that's what we're going to look at now. So let's pull up our Slack here. We use Slack here at Cireson for inter-team communication. It's gone a long way to help us to diversify what's going on. So let's go to our API testing channel here. You can see we've got some tests already done. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the apps and integrations section. I'm going to manage that. And in here you can see all the different apps that we've installed into Slack. We're going to do a custom integration. A custom integration, there's several different types here, one of which is an incoming webhook. So that means that we are triggering and sending something into Slack. You can also do outgoing, which means that based off of events within Slack, it sends or triggers something externally to itself. So in this case, we have our function here. So I'm going to go ahead and edit it. Normally you would just click the plus at the top and it would bring you to the section for a new webhook. So it does have setup instructions. It also talks to you in terms of training and how you can set up message attachments. Feel free to look at that on your own. I'm going to look at the integration settings. The one thing with the webhook is it gives you the URL here, which I'm not going to scroll over, but it's unique to you, and you need the entire key, which extends off the screen here. And ultimately, who you post as, these are default settings, but you can overwrite those inside the webhook payload. So the information you're sending inside the webhook, the body of the webhook, if you will, the body of the HTTP post request can override most, if not all, of this information. So in this case, it's giving us a preview message. If I was just to post a webhook with no information, I was to post that HTTP post call to this URL up here, then it would look just like this. So without doing anything, I would just send the text information. So once all this information is here, you copy this URL and you go ahead and save your settings, which I don't need to do because I already have them. And then we'll go into our Azure function. First, I guess we can test this. So what I use a program called Postman to test this. And what Postman does is it makes API calls across the web. You can set the type of post, you can set GET, all this information. So there's a lot of information out there, and it's a great tool, but we're just going to use it in a very simple capacity here. So in this particular example, we're just using their default message formatting example. So I've just copied and pasted that into the body of this, and then we're going to post it to that URL that they gave us. So I'm going to go ahead and hit send here. It makes the request. I get a callback in JSON format that says OK. And if I then look here in Slack, you can see that it posted the request just as I had asked it to. So we see all the different information. If we look back at Postman and we look at the body, we can see the different textual information, the different fields, and then what was sent, the colors. So all that came in exactly as we would expect. So our webhook is working. So that's a very basic example of how you can post, and it's really just that easy. So once you fill in that information, you can then send the information in. Slack has a great API for that, so feel free to browse into there. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a next step forward, and we're going to look at Azure Functions. So Azure Functions, the second piece of this particular building set, is a serverless event-driven experience that extends the existing Azure App Service Platform. Okay, that's obviously off the Microsoft site. Nano services can scale based on demand, and you can pay only for the resources you consume, and they can be triggered by webhooks, file uploader schedule. So bringing that all together and summarizing it, it's basically a function that sits in the cloud that can be triggered from a bunch of different methods. It can be written in several different programming languages, whichever you're comfortable with, and you can then trigger that and send information to it for it to do something else. In our particular case, when we get to our example, we're going to use it as a middleware that sits between the Cireson portal and Slack and translates our data coming out of the portal into something that Slack can consume. And it will then send that and post that into Slack in that manner. So why use an Azure function? Well, like we're using it for here, it's an easy way to create a middleware layer between custom applications and cloud applications. It also provides a single point of integration between multiple services. So by standardizing what you're sending to the webhook, you can reach out to multiple services within that Azure function, and you can actually pull data in and work with the data on top of whatever you triggered it with and any data you send into that, and then ultimately get a different result back. So it's a quick function-based way of computing data where it requires you to have no infrastructure and you only pay for the milliseconds of processing time that you use. So it can be incredibly economical. So in our example, we're going to, again, post a notification into Slack. What we're going to do is we're going to post what I call notification events. It's an event that's being sent out of our environment in some fashion. In our particular case, it's going to be from the Cireson portal. But then we're also going to show an example where it can come from PowerShell, but it could come from any system that can make an HTTP post request and bring that in and standardize how that gets displayed into Slack. So first we have to create the Azure function, set up the webhook trigger, and then test the function. So going back to our website here, we have the Azure portal. So this is our Azure dashboard. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to go to New, and it's as easy as typing in function. And you can see the function app here. Click it. From here, you can actually create a new function app. So you can see I can actually create a new one. I don't need to do that. It will walk you through the process. I've already created one, so I'm going to go ahead and go over to mine. So Azure function. Okay, so here's my function app. This is what it looks like after you first create it. If we were going to create a new function within this app, we can do that here as well. So once this finishes loading up, we'll then create a new function, and I'm just going to do that just to show you kind of what the options are, but I've already got my function here created, and we'll walk through the code here in just a second. So from here, I could actually create a new function, and it could be based off of a timer, so scheduled. It could be based off of data processing, meaning that it's looking in a database or looking in a blob storage or something along those lines to see if something has changed, and then triggers based off of that. Or you could do it based on a webhook or API call. And so that's obviously what we're going to do today. And then we're using JavaScript, but you can program in both JavaScript or C#. I prefer JavaScript for small functions just because while it's not as efficient as, say, C# is, it is a lot easier to write the code, and it's a lot more flexible in terms of simple code changes and those sorts of things. So that's what we're going to write it in today. So post to Slack default here is my function. So this is what a function looks like. Once you bring the function up, it gives you this URL. Well, this URL is your trigger URL. So that's where and how you could trigger this information. And then down here at the bottom, we have all the information that we need. So here we have our entire request. And so basically what happens here is we will send a request to this URL, including a body if we desire. It will trigger this function, and then it will go through and run this code. And so what we see here is actually a function that's within this function itself, just so that we can do something. In this case, it parses an array and returns a new array. But this is the function portion that you'll get, and they give you an example when you create this, and so I just created this based off of that example. But basically what's happening is once this is triggered, it will then run this module exports as well, and it'll pass in this context and request information into this. So what we're doing is we're looking at this being run, and then we're looking at the body of the request. And inside the body, we have all of our information that we require for Slack, but we have it in our own format. And so here we're going to do some translation. So what we have is we have our Slack URL. This is how we're going to post that webhook to Slack. we build our message. So we're building a little object here where we're taking in what channel we want to post to in Slack. We're looking at the username we want to post as. We have an icon emoji if we want to use an emoji as an icon for the request. You can use Markdown. If you don't know what Markdown is, just do a quick search on the internet for it, and this exact word right there, just how it's spelled. It's basically a textual way of writing out HTML code, and it translates it for you. It simplifies writing documentation that's both able to be read in text and is an HTML page as well. Fallback is if you have an old client that doesn't know how to do Slack messages. Instead, they'll just read this text out, say like a notification on your home screen of your phone. And then attachments is something in Slack that you can attach multiple attachments that each have their own bits of information to them. That's really, if we go back here, that's what this section is here. You can see it's got a little X. It's actually an attachment, and it has textual information including title and value. So we're building that message, and then we're going to post that message to Slack. Okay, and so we're doing some processing to it. So what's cool about this is what's happening is we're triggering this from somewhere else, sending some information into it, getting the body here, and then we're manipulating that data and changing it and realigning it in some way that we desire, and then we're posting it on or passing it on to somewhere else. So that's what we're doing here. So you can see that we have our function code to pass this back into Slack. So let's go ahead and, now that we have this, we can save it, and it'll sit here for us, waiting for us to call it. So what we'll do now is we'll actually test this. So going over to this here, open up a new one. I'll show you how to actually create one of these so we can post. And actually have it already. Here it is. Okay, so from here I can actually post. So you can see this is what I'm actually sending. So if I was, say, writing this in PowerShell or sending this from the portal or sending this from some other location, this is the information that I'd be passing into this Azure function. And you can see here I have this notifications array. Well, notifications isn't part of Slack. They have attachments, and I just did this little change to simplify things a little bit. So basically I have 3 forms of notification. I have error, warning, and information. By passing that information, it automatically color codes the different attachment that's coming in. So you could think of this as a incident title and an incident description, and maybe the status changes or applies to a error code, so it shows it whether it's red, green, or blue. You could really do any sort of logic you want to this, and then you just pass it out in this way, and that way it color codes what's coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And you can see that it says right down here on the function that the function was triggered. So the function started. So it's going to load up. It's a little slow the first time it loads up because it's got to load into memory. Once it's loaded into memory, it'll sit in memory for a period of time, and it reacts much quicker while it stays in memory. But right now it's loading into memory, and then you can see there it posted successfully. So now it posted to Slack. So if we go back to Slack, here's our post. So you can see that our post came through, and our error code translated out to red, and then we have warning, which translated out to yellow, and then green, which was info. And so we have our 3 different attachments for 3 different notifications. So ultimately you could do something like what we've done and what we'll do, and we'll send incidents from PowerShell or from the portal, and we'll show them in different color codes or in the color code. So say you were sending one bit of information in and you wanted to show different color code for a service request and then a incident and then a change request, you could build that into your function so it translates those accordingly. So Slack is just accepting what it accepts no matter where it's coming from, but we're translating it in our own way from any of our own internal systems. That's the benefit of us using a function in this case. Okay, so the next step is how we would do this using the Cireson portal. So the plan here is to be able to look at an incident, and then if we wanted to get some information or some team help on this particular incident, we'd go ahead and post this information of this incident into Slack. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a custom task that makes a HTTP post and passes some view model information into Slack for this to work. So I have just an example here. This is not the actual code. I'll show you the code in a second. This is actually code for what we'll be doing later, but this is another portal function to unlock an affected user. We'll show that in a little bit. But ultimately what happens is we click the post that has the code, it sends out the request, it hits our function, and then it drops this into Slack right here. So I'll give you an example of that real quick. So let's look up a request just to make this unique and real time. You can see my post to Slack function over here on the right. My website's got to warm up here. Oh, that's awesome. There's a live demo for you. We'll just restart the website. A little troubleshooting mixed into our webinar here. Okay, well, everything looks to be running, so we probably just need to log back in. There we go. Okay. All right, so I've got our list of stuff here, so let's look at this Splendid Beginnings request. Pull it up. You can see we've got a user in here. He's got some information, description, and now I want to post this to Slack because I want my team here to help me out. So I'm going to go ahead and click Post to Slack, and you saw it said Posting to Slack real quick with a screen and a progress screen, and then it posted, and if we go back in here, that's how quickly that happened. So this is already in Slack. You can see that it says, Seth Cousins would like you to look at the following work items. And then it says here the title of the work item and the description. And if I hover over this, it actually has the URL of the work item that I can go ahead and click, and it'll actually take me straight to that work item. And there it is. So you can see that just through that bit of information, and we could expand upon that in any way that we really want. Basically what we could do is we could bring in multiple options, who the affected user is, what the status of the ticket is, how long it's been sitting, when it was created. We can even do calculations around those sorts of things, or pulling up additional tickets about the user, any of that based off of a click of a button and then a function that runs in the background that you can program yourself. And it doesn't require us to build anything into the APIs for the portal. The APIs are already there. We're just getting information out that's already available to us and sending it somewhere else for something to be done with it. So that's showing you the power of this automation, the power of this request. So if we go back here, I want to show you what the code looks like. So here's our code. Basically what we're doing is I've written a function here specifically to post to Slack. You can see that it accepts the channel name, the view model is what that is, the channel name, the ID, the title, description, URL. So you could expand that to include any other option that you want. Then it posts to our Cireson function, our Azure function up there in the cloud, and then we fill in the information, and we have some notifications, and in this case, their notification is the URL and title. And then we have our success and error information, which is what you saw post into the screen, or it'll actually go into your console, so for your debugger for error checking. Down here is where we set the channel, we set the name, we set the ID, we set the title, description, URL. So all that stuff is being set and then passed into this function, which then passes it into our Azure function, translates it out, and then carries it over. So For this particular one, we have it so it just sends one object, and that's the object we're currently working with, and then asks somebody to look at that item. We'll do something a little more complex here in a little bit with PowerShell. So I just want to give you a quick look at that code. Pretty simple, really. Not too bad once you start to read through it. All right, so let's go back here. All right, so now we're going to dive a bit deeper into Azure Automation. So Azure Automation is a function of operations management suite in terms of hybrid worker. You don't actually require OMS at all just to work with Azure Automation, but if you want to reach down into your own environment on premises, then you need OMS and the OMS agent and enable it for Azure Automation. So we'll discuss some of that today. So first, Operations Manager Suite, obviously it's a cloud-based version of Operations Manager. It does not cover all of the functionality of Operations Manager as of today, but it does have a lot of great features and it has some advantages on certain areas. I posted the website here so you can go and take a look at that. This is not about Operations Management Suite, so we're not going to be discussing that today, except where it integrates into Azure Automation. So the first thing we have is we have hybrid workers. Normally Azure Automation works up in the cloud and it can hit other cloud services and other Azure services, anything in Azure, but it can't reach down into your environment. With the hybrid worker, which is really just an OMS agent that's been enabled for Azure Automation, it creates an on-premise runbook worker for you that works and functions through Azure Automation. It's got some great features in that it doesn't require any firewall changes. It actually reaches out into the cloud instead of the cloud having to punch a hole and send stuff back into it. It goes and gets the information it needs and pulls it back in and puts the information out there where it needs to. So it does all the work internally in order to make it more secure for you. So really all you need to do is install the OMS agent. Once it's installed in that machine and you've got it connected into your OMS environment, which there is a free version of, you can then install that agent locally on any computer that you want, and then you just need to enable that with this PowerShell script here. You can enable that agent to work with your Azure Automation. You'll set it up with its URL and key that you get from OMS, and then you can set a group name. And the group name is how you group together the different runbook workers. So that way it gives you a resilient solution, so you have some redundancy built in. So well, we've already done all this. Basically, we have some machines in our lab, and then those machines in the lab have OMS agents on them, and then we've added those into a default worker group, and so that's what we'll be using today. So let me show you that real fast before we move on to something else. So here in Azure, we have our OMS workspace via the OMS portal here. And you can see there's a lot of information that comes in just from what I have in my lab. I only have 3 clients in my lab, but it brings them all in. And then you have a bunch of different sections where you can add things. They have solutions gallery, but we won't go into that. So with all that in place, my workers are running, they're active, they're healthy. And so now, and I've already added them to my Azure Automation solution. So I'm going to go back to that. And let's pull up our Azure Automation account. Once you have those groups, you can then click on your hybrid worker groups in Azure Automation, and you'll see the groups that you've created by adding agents into them, and you'll see the number of workers in each group. So I only have 1 group, but I have 2 workers in it, and both those sit inside my environment. And then, so when we run our runbooks, that's where we'll run them from. So really, it's pretty much that easy. You just set up your OMS account, and you take the URL and download the agent for your environment, install it on 1 or more machines, and then enable them for Azure Automation with your information. And it ties them in here. And now they can run runbooks just by targeting that runbook. So if I was to click on one of these and I say I wanted to run this, I could say start. and it'll ask me for my parameters. I can either run it up here in the cloud, or I can choose a hybrid worker and I can choose the group. I don't need to do that, so I'm not going to. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's look at this next piece. All right, so PowerShell. So almost everybody on this call is probably very familiar with PowerShell. So what we're actually going to do is take a quick look at how you can use PowerShell to invoke an API. So in this particular case, we're going to use the invoke REST method, and then we're going to post. We're going to use a post, not a get. You could do a get. You could do any of the valid HTTP request types. In this case, we're going to do a post. We're going to pass a body that's in JSON format into that, and then we have the URL where we're passing that all into. So if you take a look at the screenshot I have here, this screenshot is our function for posting a message into Slack. You can see it looks a lot like the JavaScript that I already showed you for what we did in the portal, and it is very similar in nature. Basically, it takes in the different values, and then it compiles those values into a body or a message, as we used in the other one, and then it converts all that to JSON and uses the invoke REST method to post that to our Azure function. So let me pull up the code here. Here is the rest of the code. So this is the tricky part. So that's just basically the same thing we did before, but it gets a little tricky because we're going to have this run from a different machine, and we're going to have it stored in Azure. We're using the Azure Automation ISE add-on here, which is awesome. If you're working with Azure, you can load and sync runbooks all up into the cloud and then even publish them from here. So it's a great way of working with the ISE, which you're familiar with, but then importing up into the cloud there to run in Azure Automation. All right, so what we're doing is we're actually running this command, and it's going to run on any of, it could, so in Azure Automation, you don't get to choose which runbook worker it works on. So if it runs on server A, server B, or server C, if they're all in the same worker group, it could run on any one of them. You don't know which one it's going to be run on. It's basically whichever one picks up the job. So if the job gets picked up, it could be running on A, B, or C. So what we want to do is we're going to use a remote command, and we're going to invoke this command on our service management server so that it doesn't matter which server it actually originates from. It's going to actually be run on the service management server. So that's why we're invoking this command at the top, and we're targeting our SCSM01 server. What I'm doing in this particular case is I'm running it every 5 minutes through an Azure scheduler, and in order to make that work, I want to know the exact time it last ran, and then I look at any new objects that have been created, any new incidents that have been created since it last ran. So I'm actually keeping track by dropping a JSON file with the last runtime in the directory. So that's what the path is you see at the top. Here's our function to send to our Azure function. And then down here at the bottom, we have our information for checking that path, creating the JSON file, creating it if it didn't get created. Then we get the current date and time if it doesn't have one already. Otherwise, we get the last run date and time by reading that JSON file. And then we look at when it last ran, and then we get our incident class. Then we get all incidents that have been created since the last time this ran. So we look at it and we say, okay, there's been this many incidents since the last time this ran based on this JSON file. Give me those incidents. Then it looks at immediately after getting them, it sets the time that it ran to keep it as accurate as possible. Then it shows how many incidents we got, and then it runs our function to, and then it runs our send Slack message function. So for each work item or each incident, we're going to create a new attachment, or in this case, notification, with the info type, the title and description from each of those. And then we're going to post that to Azure, to the Azure function. So then we're using our send to Slack. So some of you may be wondering, well, why don't you just post this directly into Slack then, if that's the case? Why not? Why go through the added roundabout of posting through the Azure function? Well, the reason is because we want to show this as an example of how we can standardize our notification calls across different areas of the environment. So what we've already done is we've shown how we can use that Azure function to post from the portal, which we could have designed that one specifically for Slack as well. But then you're building each thing uniquely, and now each one has to be supported uniquely. What we can do instead is we could have 10 different applications that allow to be posted into Slack. They all touch one Azure function. So the only time we'd have to make changes is to that Azure function if Slack changes something. So if Slack changes how you post or when you post or what gets posted or what it looks like, all we have to do is go back to our Azure function and build in a little bit of code to translate that or mitigate those changes. We don't have to go back and change all 10 of our functions, all 10 of our environmental notification sections just to change whatever, just to deal with whatever Slack changed. So this is a way of providing a middleware and a level of resiliency against changes that we can't control. Okay, so what this one does is it actually uses an Azure schedule and runs every 5 minutes and then posts into Slack. So to demonstrate that this works, I have a little function here that builds incidents for me. So I'm going to go ahead and build 3 new incidents. Okay, so that just created 3 new incidents for me. So the trick into knowing that this worked is when we go back here to Slack, that should be running every 5 minutes. And so next time it runs, it should see that it has 3 new incidents and it should post them into Slack for me. So I should see those pop up here within the next 5 minutes, depending on the last runtime, telling me that, hey, these 3 new incidents were created since the last time I ran. And you can tell if that's running because we have our scheduler here. So you can see all the different run times for our scheduler. So we'll go ahead and let that sit and see if it runs, but in the meantime, we'll move forward. So that is our PowerShell and how to invoke a REST method and inside PowerShell and pass on that JSON value. So the next step is scheduling. So if you wanted to schedule a runbook in Azure Automation, which is what we did, we scheduled it for every 5 minutes, there's 2 options. So first, there's a built-in runbook schedule. So what that does is it's right there on your runbook in Azure Automation. When you click on the runbook, you can click on a schedule and you can have it run over a certain period of time. But it's limited in terms of how often it can run. So if you do just from there, the lowest possible time is once every hour, which in many cases, that's probably not going to work for you. And it didn't work for me in this example. I wanted every 5 minutes. So with that, it may not be as easy to configure, but we can go in and create an Azure scheduler. So the Azure scheduler allows you to create schedules that can be used across different areas of Azure, including running webhooks. So what we did is we configured the Azure scheduler and set up a schedule to run every 5 minutes. And then what that does is it sends a post to our Azure Automation webhook. So that's right, we used a webhook in our Azure runbook. So let's take a look at that real quick. So if we go here to our Azure dashboard, we can go to our Azure Automation account. We'll look at our runbook. This is our Get SCSM incident since last run. That's our runbook there. We'll go ahead and click on that. You can see I don't have any schedules, but I do have one webhook. So by creating that webhook, I then can go to my Azure scheduler and create a scheduler job for 5 minutes. So here's my scheduler job, and the action is to post to that webhook URL whenever my 5 minutes is up. So every 5 minutes it says, boom, hey, URL trigger. So then it triggers that Azure Automation job, that runbook. So every 5 minutes that runbook gets triggered. And I can take a look at the schedule. I can see that the last run was 4 minutes ago, which means that we're about to trigger again. And when that triggers, that's when I should see the information show up in Slack. So we'll wait for a little asterisk to show up here, but it should be in the near future. Okay, so that's scheduling. So just through that method there and walking through and just creating that scheduler and a little schedule job, I can then schedule my run books to do whatever I want. So I can have them run as often as I want. There's a very, very small penny fee or whatever for running a scheduler job. So it's negligible. You pay more in electricity probably. All right. So that will trigger that whole job. So now what we've got is we've got a scheduled trigger that triggers an Azure Automation runbook that runs a PowerShell script on our on-prem servers to grab all the recent SCSM incidents and post them into Slack for us as attachments in the way that we understand. So very easy to do. I mean, it's several steps, but once you have it set up, you can add into it very easily. And really the sky's the limit on what you can do with that. So with that being said, let's look at how we might want to use this. So one of the things that we get asked a lot and people want to deal with is how to unlock an AD user. Generally, you would have an analyst that comes in, and that analyst either has to have permissions to do it and know how to do it and all those sorts of things to get into Active Directory, find the user's account and unlock the user. Or there has to be some method where the user can perform some automation of their own in order to unlock the user. So what we've done in this particular example is set up a Cireson portal task, and that Cireson portal task will actually help us to unlock the user. So if the user comes in and he's complaining that he's locked out, then what this will do is we can just click a function and it will go and look at that affected user, find that affected user, and run an Azure Automation runbook that will go down into our environment and run a PowerShell script to unlock that user for us. So that's what we're going to look at today, is from start to finish how we created this. And in this particular case, we're not using a Azure function. We're using just Azure Automation. I've already shown you how you could use an Azure function instead if you wanted to. But since we want to reach down into our environment, we need that Azure Automation. So we're going to put together Azure Automation, Webhooks, PowerShell, and the Cireson portal to create this solution. So let's start with the demo. All right. So the first thing we need is we need a working script that unlocks a user account. So what we've done here, really unlocking a user account is as simple as running this PowerShell command. So this is how simple it is to just do it, but in order to deal with the user being wrong or the analyst being wrong or how it comes in, those sorts of things, we have to do some additional work. So what we're doing is we actually have, again, the invoke command, and we're running it on a computer, and in this particular case, it's going to be on our DC since we're unlocking this account, and we don't know which automation server it's going to run on. Let me digress really quick and show you that just a minute ago, our incidents came in. So you can see they came in about 3 minutes ago, actually. And 3 new incidents. Here's the 3 incidents that I created, posted by PowerShell on its regular scheduled interval. So, all right. So what we want to do here is we want to invoke this script. We're going to pass a username parameter to the script block, and that username is going to be the one that we unlock. So what we're doing in this case is we're passing that username into this block. Username's passing forward. We then load the Active Directory module. We check to see if the user's locked out. So we get the status of them being locked out, whether it's true or false. If it is true and they are locked out, then we unlock that username and we post the results that the account was unlocked. If it was not locked out, we get the username, we check the user, and it was not locked out, then we basically put a status up that says it was not locked out. If for some reason there's an error and neither of these applies, somehow user doesn't exist, something like that, then we're just going to return that result as failed so that you know that there's something more going on there. You'd probably want to build in a little bit more error checking, maybe just pass back the error, something along those lines. And then we're going to return the result, which is going to be failed, account unlocked, or account not locked, and then the username. We're going to return it from this invoke command that's run on this other machine, and we're going to write that output to the Azure runbook console. So that's the script there. Now that would just run, and that would just run in Azure anyway. What we want to do is we want this to be triggered by a webhook, and we also want to be able to pass the user's name from that webhook. So when we put this into a Azure runbook and we add a webhook trigger to it, Azure will automatically pass this parameter object called webhook data to this PowerShell script. So we are setting a default value here just for testing reasons so that I could test it both here in my ISE, and then I could also test it from up in Azure with a real-time test without even sending webhook data. But what happens is when real webhook data comes in, it overrides these values. So it's just like passing a standard parameter. So we have a webhook parameter. Inside that webhook parameter, there's a request body property, and that request body property is the JSON body, or the body of the webhook request in JSON. So to show you what that looks like, let's go to our postman down here. So this is what the JSON body of the webhook would look like. So when we're passing this webhook to our Azure runbook webhook, we would just pass this information as the body, just some JSON, and then it would come in and that passes the username for us. So I could actually unlock the user account just by sending this request right now. So it's pretty much that simple. So going back to this, we would then upload this PowerShell script up into Azure. So let's go to Azure, our automation account here, and look at our runbook. So this is our runbook right here. So if I click this, you can see that we have one webhook attached, and if I wanted to, I could view the code as well. And there's our code. So you have the object webhook information that's coming in. We then convert that request body into a PowerShell object from JSON. That lets us work with it just like we would any PowerShell object. Do what we need to do, unlock the account, and pass it back. We then, of course, targeted a runbook worker, a hybrid worker group with this here. So if we look at this, we can look at the parameters of this. You can see that for this webhook, we want to run this request, we want to run it on a hybrid worker, and we want to use our default group. You could, of course, select a different group, and then you click OK. You get the URL from the webhook when you create the webhook. So whenever you add a new webhook, it'll give you a new URL. And then you need to copy that URL because after it's created, there's no way to get the URL from within Azure again. So that URL is gone forever if you didn't copy and paste it. You'll have to create a new webhook to get the new URL. All right, so that gives us our webhook. When that webhook comes in, it brings in that JSON body that we're passing from here, brings that body in, and then we parse it, and then we use it to unlock the user. It runs that Azure script on that hybrid host, goes down into our environment, invokes the command going to DC01 lab.local, and that's where it'll run and unlock the user account. So the next step of that is how would we do that from the portal? So let's look at the portal real quick. So here we have our portal. Here we have an incident. Let's find an incident that has an affected user on it. Bring up my DC here. Oh, that's not that bad. Okay. Actually, I just use PowerShell. Big click there. All right. So what we want to do is import. We're just going to use this to check our work. So first things first. I can actually do this from my web browser. So Cireson Spango, great name. Timed out. Okay. All right, so let's find his real username. Here's his real username. I'm going to use this just for posterity. All right, so that's our user. If I go back to my DC here, I can do a and properties. All right, so we can see he's not currently locked out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a run as user, run a command prompt, fake password. All right, now he's locked out. Just to confirm that, we're going to confirm it. Oh, yep, he's locked out. So good old Terrapin's locked out. All right, so now that he's locked out, in this thing he says, or he said he's having a problem with his account getting locked out regularly. He's locked out currently. He sent this in via email from a separate account or whatever. This obviously there's a few holes in how this is exactly working. What you may want to do is have an alternate contact or have this requested by, because the affected user will come in requested by somebody else that his account is locked out. So what we'll want to do is we'll want to unlock that account for him. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over here and we're going to click unlock affected user. It's going to say runbook triggered, could take up to 2 minutes to complete. So we'll just wait a few seconds here for this to go. It shouldn't take that long. Okay, so now let's take a look at Azure. Let's take a look at our unlock AD user account. Let's look at jobs, and we can see that one is running right now. So it's running, so we'll go ahead and go back to our DC here. Oh, he's already unlocked. So he's unlocked, and we can say, back to our incident and say, change status, resolved, fixed by analysts. Account has been unlocked. Done. And that's how it works. So now let's look at the code inside the console that triggers the runbook. We've already looked at it for the most part. This is just a slight iteration over the same bit of code. So this is actually simpler than the previous one I showed you from posting to Slack, because all we're doing is triggering that Azure Automation runbook. So here you have the view model. We're grabbing the affected user's username. You could do a related user. You could do the requested by user. You could do anything you want because it's all there in the view model. You just find the username. We're capturing that username, and then we're posting that as a JSON body to the webhook. And then we're parsing that with that PowerShell I showed you earlier, and that's it. And that triggers the runbook, passes the data goes out, the runbook runs, gets passed to our hybrid worker down there, and runs on the actual hybrid worker in our environment, which then remotes into our DC from whichever worker it might be, and unlocks the user's account. And that's it. So that's a great example of how you can use the Cireson portal to trigger web-based interface, and how we can use Azure Automation to perform changes in a resilient fashion down in our environment. So you could do this with just about anything: resetting a password, sending a user an email, moving a file for somebody, changing or adding permissions, any of that could be run in this exact same manner. And if you have a task that you do all the time, it's now a candidate for automation. And that's it. So I hope that gives you guys a great example of what you can do with the Cireson portal and with the combination of Azure Functions, Azure Automation, and then also how you can reach out to third-party websites and web sources and any other cloud-based technologies you use to either bring data in, trigger data, or push data out. So that is it for today. Just a few bits of information here. We have the Cireson community where we talk through and do various things around this, answer questions both in regards to Cireson products and Service Manager, and really just anything in general. You can reach out to us via the Cireson community. We've got over 1,000 users there now, actively working and talking on the site. Some great customers that really know what they're talking about are contributing as well. So come join us and help to make it an even better place. So I'm going to get to questions here in just a second. Just running through the regular bits of information. So here's some resources that you can look at. This webinar will be posted today at Vimeo. I've already done some more detailed information in terms of blogs on my website and on the Cireson website. You can also look at the Cireson community and then a bit of information about the platform and other Cireson products. All right, so now it's time for questions. So if anybody has questions, please post them and I will do my best to answer them. So we have one from Bill here, and he says, what is the advantage of doing the task in that manner over just having a PowerShell task to unlock the account? Is performance the only consideration? So the benefit is that you only unlock counts when you want to. So having a PowerShell task, one, it's permissions too. You can actually give people permissions via the portal to run this task that don't have permissions to AD at all. So basically that person could have 0 AD permissions and yet you could still give him the ability to unlock a user account. And because it's a complete control automation process, there's nothing he can do outside of that to gain additional access. So it's an easy way to give permissions for repetitive tasks that normally that user would not have permissions for, and reduces your permission workload. So that's one way, one reason to do it. Performance could be a consideration just in terms of when you say in that manner instead of just using a PowerShell task to unlock the account, I mean, we are using it. So outside of permissions, it just depends on how you want to trigger that. So in our case, we wanted it to be right there, right in front of you via the portal. You cannot trigger a PowerShell task from a web browser. Not without some form of third-party or custom web service that has been built to allow that to happen. The reason is you can't execute something from a web browser. So this provides you a method of executing PowerShell in a controlled Microsoft ecosystem without having to bypass those security features as well. So that's two reasons to do it this way. And you may not do it this way for something as simple as an unlock if your analysts already have that ability, but it does give you an excellent example of how you can run other more complex PowerShell scripts without the user having permissions, without the analyst having permissions, using this method. All right, well, Bill's the only one that asked a question, so it looks like that's all we have for today. If you guys do have any other questions, feel free to post them in the Cireson community or send them to me directly, and I'll answer them as best that I can. I appreciate everybody for coming out and watching today, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.